A pregnant Amish girl was traded to a giant cowboy as payment for debts. In a dusty saloon, her own father gave her away like property, while the townsfolk jeered and the church bell tolled. But the cowboy who claimed her didn't want a servant. He had shocking plans no one could have imagined. On the lonely ranch, whispers spread. Some called him cursed, others said he'd gone mad. Yet under the prairie stars, he swore to protect her and the child she carried. Then came the storm, the gambler father returning with guns, and the girl's labor beginning too soon. A Ute midwife braved the night to save them. But not everyone in town wanted mercy to triumph over law. Will this cowboy's vow bring redemption, or will the weight of shame and bullets tear their fragile hope apart? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments, share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The saloon's smoky haze hung thick in the air as cards slapped against the green felt table. Laughter and jeers echoed off the wooden walls, while Elias Yoda's weathered hands trembled over his last failing hand. The once proud Amish farmer had fallen far from his community's ways, and tonight his descent reached a new low. "Ain't got nothing left to bet with," Elias muttered, his eyes darting between the other players' predatory grins. One of the card sharks, a man with a gold tooth that caught the lamplight, leaned forward. "Word is you got a daughter waiting outside. Pretty little thing in that plain dress." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Elias's face twitched, shame warring with desperation. After a long moment he stood and walked to the saloon's swinging doors. When he returned, he wasn't alone. Miriam Yoda stood in her modest dress and white prayer covering, her eyes downcast as rough men whistled and called out crude suggestions. Her hands rested protectively over her growing belly, and her cheeks burned red with humiliation. She looked like a dove among vultures. "Reckon she'll cover my marker," Elias said, his voice hollow. "She's young, strong, good worker." The crowd pressed closer, their hungry eyes taking the measure of this unexpected offering. But before anyone could speak, a shadow fell across the table. The room grew quiet as Caleb Boone stepped forward, his tall frame towering over the seated gamblers. Everyone knew Boone, the giant rancher who kept to himself since losing his sweetheart years back. He rarely came to town except for supplies, and he never joined in the saloon's revelry. But tonight, something in his stern face had changed. "I'll take that trade," Caleb said quietly. His deep voice carried authority without raising above a murmur. "Your debt's cleared, Yoda." The gold-toothed gambler started to protest, but one look at Caleb's steady gaze made him reconsider. The rancher's reputation for honest dealing was matched only by his strength, and few men were foolish enough to challenge either. Caleb stepped closer to Miriam, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. The touch was gentle, barely there, but it formed a barrier between her and the leering crowd. "Miss Yoda, if you'll come with me." Miriam glanced up, meeting his eyes for the first time. What she saw there, not cruelty or base desire, but something steadier, made her draw a shaky breath. She nodded once, barely perceptible. The crowd parted as Caleb guided her through the saloon. Someone made a crude comment, but it died quickly under Caleb's measured stare. Outside, the evening air was cooling, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. His wagon stood ready, the horses stamping impatiently. Without a word, Caleb helped Miriam onto the wooden seat. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, careful to leave space between them. The wagon wheels creaked as they pulled away from the hitching post, leaving behind the glow of the saloon's windows and the whispers of the townsfolk gathering to watch them go. They rode in silence as the town fell away behind them. The prairie stretched out under the darkening sky, waves of grass rippling in the wind. Dust devils danced in their wake, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Miriam sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every few minutes, she would steal a glance at the big man beside her, trying to read his intentions in his profile. The steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves marked time as the miles passed. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice as gentle as his earlier touch. "You'll have a proper room at the ranch house. Clean bed, good food. Nobody'll trouble you there." Miriam's shoulders trembled slightly, whether from the evening chill or relief, it wasn't clear. "Why?" she whispered. Caleb kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but his jaw tightened at the question. "Ain't right what your pa did. No daughter should be traded like cattle." He paused, then added softly, "You and your little one deserve better." A single tear tracked down Miriam's cheek, quickly wiped away. She didn't speak again, but some of the tension left her frame. Above them, stars began to pierce the purple dusk, and a quarter moon rose to light their way across the prairie. They continued on through the gathering night, the wagon swaying gently beneath them. Caleb drove with sure hands, following a trail he knew by heart. And though Miriam's future remained uncertain, for the first time that day, her hands relaxed their desperate grip on each other. Whatever waited at the end of this journey, she had escaped something worse, and the quiet strength of the man beside her offered at least the hope of safety. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of prairie sage and distant rain. It caught at Miriam's bonnet strings and ruffled the horses' manes as they made their way toward Caleb's ranch, where a lamp burned in the window, a beacon in the growing dark. The wagon wheels rattled over the rutted trail as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose. Miriam held her small bundle of belongings close, her lips moving in silent prayer for her unborn child. Each bump made her tense, but she couldn't help noticing how Caleb handled the reins with extraordinary care, guiding the horses around the worst of the rough spots. The gentle giant beside her kept scanning the horizon, his broad shoulders blocking the worst of the evening wind. When a particularly hard jolt threatened, he would reach out as if to steady her, then draw back, mindful of proper distance. "Not much further now," Caleb said softly, nodding toward a ridge ahead. As they crested the rise, his ranch spread out before them, a testament to years of patient work. The main house stood solid and weathered, its windows catching the last rays of sunlight. A well-maintained barn faced a sturdy corral, where several horses lifted their heads at the wagon's approach. Beyond stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed in the gathering dusk. Near the barn, a figure straightened from his work. Amos Fletcher, Caleb's longtime ranch hand, set down his tools and walked toward them, his steps measured and wary. His graying beard and weathered face spoke of decades under the western sun, and his sharp eyes missed nothing as Caleb brought the wagon to a halt. "Mr. Boone," Amos said, his gaze fixed on Miriam. "Heard there was some excitement in town today." Caleb stepped down from the wagon and moved to help Miriam. His hands were steady and respectful as he assisted her to the ground. "Miss Yoda will be staying with us, Amos. She needs a safe place." The old ranch hand's expression darkened as he took in Miriam's plain dress, her prayer covering, and the slight swell of her middle. "A word, if you please," he said to Caleb, already turning toward the barn. "Make yourself comfortable on the porch, Miss Yoda," Caleb said quietly. "I'll be just a moment." Miriam nodded, clutching her bundle as she made her way to the wooden chairs on the front porch. Though they spoke in low voices by the barn, fragments of the men's conversation carried on the evening breeze. "Have you lost your mind?" Amos's harsh whisper cut through the air. "An unmarried, pregnant girl? And Amish, no less? The gossip's probably already started in town. Don't care about gossip." Caleb's reply was firm. Her own father tried to trade her to gamblers. She stays under my protection." Just like that. Without thinking what this could mean for the ranch? For your reputation? "I've made my decision, Amos." There was steel in Caleb's quiet voice. "She stays." The conversation ended with Amos's frustrated sigh. Both men returned to the house, where Caleb led them inside to a simple but clean kitchen. A pot of stew simmered on the wood stove, filling the air with the scent of beef and vegetables. Supper was a tense affair. Miriam sat with her eyes downcast, barely touching the food on her plate. Caleb kept glancing her way between careful spoonfuls, as if checking that she was still there. Amos focused on his bowl, occasionally muttering about people talking and "mark my words." The silence stretched uncomfortably until Caleb stood and cleared his throat. "Let me show you to your room, Miss Yoda." He led her up a narrow staircase to a small but tidy bedroom. A patchwork quilt covered the bed, and simple curtains framed a window overlooking the prairie. A wooden cross hung on one wall, testament to the faith Caleb held, even if he rarely spoke of it. "The washroom's down the hall," he said, shifting his weight. "If you need anything." He trailed off, then added softly, "You're safe here, Miss Yoda. Nobody will harm you or your little one while you're under my roof." After he left, Miriam stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed by the day's events. Slowly she sank to her knees beside the bed, her hands clasped in prayer. Tears fell silently onto the colorful quilt as she poured out her fear, gratitude, and confusion to the Lord. In the hallway, Caleb paused at the sound of her muffled prayers. His hand rested against the doorframe, and pain flickered across his features, a shadow of old grief that still haunted him. The memory of another woman's prayers, of hopes for a child that ended in tragedy, weighed heavy on his heart. After a long moment, he turned away, his footsteps quiet as he descended the stairs. In her room, Miriam's prayers gradually slowed. She raised her head, looking around at the simple, clean space. No locks on the door, a Bible on the bedside table, fresh towels folded on the dresser. Every detail spoke not of captivity, but of genuine hospitality. For the first time since her father's betrayal, something like hope stirred in her heart. This giant of a man, this quiet rancher, had offered her not just shelter but dignity. She wasn't property to be traded or used. Here she was a guest. The revelation brought fresh tears, but these were different. As she prepared for bed, the sound of men's voices drifted up from below, Caleb's low rumble and Amos's gruff responses. Though the old ranch hand's suspicion was clear, it was Caleb's earlier words that echoed in her mind. "She stays under my protection." Perhaps, Miriam thought as she slipped beneath the quilt, God had not abandoned her after all. Perhaps he had led her to this place, to these people, for a purpose she couldn't yet see. With that fragile seed of trust taking root in her heart, she closed her eyes, the prairie wind singing a lullaby outside her window. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, painting golden squares on the worn wooden floor. Miriam stood in the doorway, her hands folded at her apron. The scent of fresh coffee already filled the air. Amos had started the pot before dawn, as was his habit. "I could cook breakfast," she offered softly, watching as Caleb moved around the kitchen. "To thank you for your kindness." Caleb turned from the stove, a concerned look crossing his features. "You should rest, Miss Yoda. In your condition." "Lord have mercy," Amos muttered from his seat at the table. "Gone soft as spring butter, you have. Girl knows her way around a kitchen, I'd wager." A faint smile touched Miriam's lips. "Please, I'd like to help." Caleb hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside. Miriam moved with quiet efficiency, gathering cornmeal, eggs, and buttermilk. Her hands worked with practiced grace as she mixed the batter, adding a pinch of salt and a sprinkle of sugar, her mother's secret touch. The kitchen filled with the sound of sizzling as she poured the batter onto the hot griddle. Soon, the aroma of fresh cornmeal cakes joined the coffee's rich scent. She stacked them high on a plate, golden brown and steaming. Amos's eyebrows rose as he took his first bite. "Well now," he said, surprise softening his gruff voice. "These ain't half bad." "They're excellent," Caleb said quietly, watching as Miriam poured more batter onto the griddle. After breakfast, Miriam insisted on helping with the morning chores. The spring air was crisp as she followed Caleb to the barn, carrying a bucket of kitchen scraps for the chickens. She scattered the feed, watching as the hens pecked eagerly at the ground. That's when she noticed it. A slight hesitation in Caleb's step as he carried hay to the horses. His right leg dragged just slightly, a limp he tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. "You're hurt," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Caleb stilled, his broad shoulders tensing. For a long moment he said nothing, just stood there with his hands on the hay bale. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, heavy with memory. "Horse threw me, years back." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. I was riding for the doctor. Sarah, my sweetheart, she was in labor, too early. The baby." His voice caught. Neither of them made it. Miriam's hand flew to her mouth, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. "Folks in town," they started whispering, "said I was cursed, said any woman who tied herself to me was doomed." He gave a bitter laugh. "Maybe they're right." "No," Miriam said firmly, surprising herself with her conviction. "God doesn't work that way." Caleb looked at her then, something vulnerable in his eyes. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Later that morning, Caleb hitched the wagon for a trip into town. "We need supplies," he explained, helping Miriam up onto the seat. "Flour, sugar, some fabric if you need it." The ride was peaceful, but as they approached town, Miriam felt her anxiety rising. The wagon wheels clattered on the packed dirt of the main street, and heads turned to watch their passage. Whispers followed them like shadows. "Shameless," someone hissed as they passed. "Living in sin," another voice carried clearly. A group of women outside the millinery drew back, as if Miriam's presence might taint them. A man on the boardwalk pointed and quoted scripture about fallen women, his voice raised to ensure they heard. Miriam's cheeks burned with shame. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded tightly in her lap. At the general store, Caleb helped her down, his hand steady and protective at her elbow. Inside, the shopkeeper's wife watched them with narrow eyes as they gathered their supplies. Caleb methodically selected what they needed while Miriam looked at fabric, trying to ignore the hostile stares. The bell above the door chimed, and Reverend Matthews stepped in. The preacher's face darkened at the sight of them. "Caleb Boone," he said, his voice carrying through the store. "I must speak with you about this situation." Caleb turned slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Reverend, you're sinning against common decency, keeping that girl under your roof." The preacher's eyes flickered to Miriam with barely concealed disgust. An unmarried woman in her condition. It's a scandal. A mockery of God's law. Miriam felt the weight of every eye in the store. Her hands trembled as she set down the bolt of fabric she'd been examining. But Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between her and the preacher's accusing stare. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, carrying clearly in the hushed store. "Judge me if you will, Reverend. She's safe now. That's all that matters." The preacher's face flushed red. "The Lord sees—" "Yes," Caleb cut him off. He does. He sees everything, including what would have happened to her if I hadn't stepped in. He turned to the shopkeeper. We'll take the supplies now. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but when they cleared the town limits, Miriam found her voice. I'm sorry, she whispered. The things they're saying about you. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. Don't fret about that. Words can't hurt me, none. He glanced at her, concern in his eyes. Can't say the same for you, though. You shouldn't have to bear their spite. Miriam looked out across the prairie, where spring grass waved in the wind. The Lord tests us all differently, she said softly. Perhaps this is my test. To learn to trust in his plan, even when the path seems dark. Caleb fell quiet at that, but his posture softened slightly. The wagon rolled on toward home, leaving the town's judgment behind them, at least for now. The afternoon sun warmed their backs, and ahead, the ranch buildings rose against the sky like a promise of sanctuary. The wagon wheels rattled against the rutted road, each bump sending a shudder through the wooden frame. Miriam sat rigid beside Caleb, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The cruel whispers from town still rang in her ears, sharp as thorns. Harlot, they had called her. Fallen woman. A tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another. She tried to brush them away discreetly, but Caleb noticed. Without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, offering it to her without taking his eyes from the road. Much obliged, Miriam whispered, dabbing at her eyes. The simple kindness of the gesture made her throat tight with emotion. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the sky in soft golds and pinks. Amos had supper waiting, a pot of beans with salt pork and cornbread. The old ranch hand had kept the coffee hot, too, though his expression was as sour as week-old milk. They ate in silence for a while, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound. Finally, Amos set down his cup with a sharp clack. Saw Thompson in town yesterday, he said, his voice gruff. Says the bank's watching you close now, Caleb. Folk talking about pulling their business. Caleb continued eating, his movements measured and calm. You'll ruin yourself over this girl. Amos pressed on. Everything you built here, all of it at risk. For what? Some fool notion of being a savior? The words hung heavy in the air. Miriam's spoon trembled in her hand, shame burning in her chest. But before she could speak, Caleb looked up from his bowl, meeting Amos's hard stare. The Lord measures a man not by gossip, he said quietly, his deep voice firm and steady, but by mercy. Amos snorted and pushed back from the table. Mercy won't pay the mortgage. He muttered, but there was less bite in his tone. He gathered his dishes and headed for the door. I'll check the north fence before dark. After supper, Miriam helped clean up, though Caleb insisted she shouldn't strain herself. The familiar routine of washing dishes brought a small measure of comfort, but sleep proved elusive when she finally retired to her room. She lay in bed, listening to the nighttime sounds of the prairie, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of wind through the grass. Then another sound caught her attention. A low, gentle humming from outside her window. Curious, Miriam rose and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She padded softly to the front door and eased it open. Caleb sat on the porch steps, a piece of wood in his hands that he was carefully shaping with a small knife. In the moonlight, she could see the curve of what looked like a small horse taking form under his skilled fingers. But it was the tune he was humming that made her pause. Amazing Grace, her mother's favorite hymn. The boards creaked softly under her feet as she stepped onto the porch. Caleb's hands stilled, but he didn't turn around. Did I wake you? He asked softly. No, Miriam replied, settling carefully on the other end of the step. I couldn't sleep. Caleb nodded, his knife moving again over the wood. Neither could I. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the night air cool and sweet around them. Finally, Miriam gathered her courage to speak. That hymn. I haven't heard it sung so gentle before. Caleb's hands paused again. Haven't sung at all since Sarah passed. He admitted, his voice rough with memory. Not even in church. Felt like my voice died with her. Miriam's heart ached at the pain in his words. Without thinking, she began to sing softly, her clear voice carrying the familiar words into the night. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me. For a moment, Caleb sat motionless. Then, slowly, his deep voice joined hers, uncertain at first, but growing stronger. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Their voices twined together, rising up toward the star-studded sky. Miriam felt something shift inside her chest, as if a heavy stone had been lifted away. The shame that had weighed her down since that terrible night in the saloon seemed to fade, carried away by the ancient words of hope and redemption. When the last note faded into the prairie night, they sat in peaceful silence. Caleb's knife moved steadily over the wooden horse, each careful cut bringing more detail to life. Thank you, he said finally, so quiet she almost missed it. Miriam smiled softly, feeling more at peace than she had in weeks. Good night, Mr. Boone, she said, rising carefully to her feet. Good night, Miss Yoder, he replied. As she turned to go inside, she caught his expression in the moonlight. Something had softened in his weathered features, a glimmer of hope where before there had been only carefully guarded pain. Miriam fell asleep easily after that, the hymn still echoing in her heart. Outside her window, the vast prairie stretched peaceful and dark under the stars, while far beyond the horizon, storm clouds gathered unseen. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as life settled into a gentle rhythm. Miriam sat in her rocking chair on the porch, needle flashing in the golden light as she worked on tiny garments for her coming child. The soft cotton fabric felt smooth beneath her fingers as she carefully joined each seam. From her perch, she could see Caleb at the well, his broad shoulders working the pump handle as he filled bucket after bucket. His movements were steady and sure, like everything else he did. When he caught her watching, he tipped his hat with a slight smile. The garden beckoned with its neat rows of vegetables, and Miriam set aside her sewing. Despite her advancing pregnancy, she yearned to be useful. The earth looked thirsty, and the tomato plants needed tending. Let me help with the watering, she called to Caleb, already reaching for one of the filled buckets. Miss Yoder, he started to protest, but she gave him a determined look. I may be with child, Mr. Boone, but I'm not made of glass. She lifted the bucket, though not quite as easily as she pretended. The good Lord gave us hands for working. Caleb watched her for a moment, then nodded. At least let me carry the heavy ones. They worked together in companionable silence, Miriam kneeling carefully to pull weeds while Caleb hauled water. The morning passed peacefully until a sudden darkness fell over the garden. Looking up, Miriam saw heavy clouds rolling in from the west, their bellies dark with rain. A gust of wind whipped her bonnet strings, and the first fat drops began to fall. Before she could stand, Caleb was there, strong hands helping her to her feet. Storm's coming fast, he said, concern etched on his face. We need to get inside. The sky opened up just as they reached the porch, rain falling in sheets. Caleb's arm was steady around her shoulders, shielding her from the worst of it. Thunder rolled across the prairie like God's own wagon. That evening, they sat in the warmth of the lamplight, listening to the storm rage outside. Miriam's hands were busy with mending, while Caleb whittled another small wooden figure. He'd been leaving them on her windowsill each morning, a growing menagerie of careful craftsmanship. "Tell me about your people," Caleb said softly, his knife moving steadily over the wood. "Your ways seem full of peace." Miriam's needle paused. "We believe in living plain and close to God's word," she began, "in forgiveness even when it's hard." Her voice caught slightly. "Especially when it's hard." "Like with your father?" Caleb asked gently. She nodded, blinking back tears. "The English, those outside our faith, they don't understand sometimes. They see our plain dress and simple ways as backward. But there's wisdom in it. Pride and fancy things, they pull the heart from God. And forgiveness." Caleb's hands had gone still. "It's not for the other person," Miriam said carefully. "It's for your own soul's peace. To hold on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." She looked down at her hands. "I'm trying to forgive him. Some days it's harder than others." Caleb studied her face in the lamplight, struck by the quiet strength there. Here was a girl who'd been traded away like cattle, yet still held fast to her faith. His respect for her deepened. Sunday dawned clear and bright. Miriam smoothed her plain dress nervously as Caleb helped her into the wagon. The thought of facing the town again made her stomach flutter, but she straightened her shoulders. God's house was where she belonged, no matter what others might think. The little white church stood proud against the blue sky, its bell calling the faithful to worship. As Caleb helped Miriam down from the wagon, she felt the stares of the arriving congregants. Some turned away coldly, whispering behind their hands. But others, more than before, offered small nods of greeting. Inside, they sat near the back, though Caleb's height made him impossible to miss. The sermon spoke of mercy and judgment, and Miriam felt the words keenly. She noticed several heads turn to look their way during those passages. After the final prayer, Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife, approached them. Her face was kind as she addressed Miriam. "We've heard you have a gift for song," she said. "Would you share a hymn with us?" Miriam's heart jumped. She glanced at Caleb, who gave her an encouraging nod. Walking to the front of the church felt like the longest journey of her life. But as she turned to face the congregation, peace settled over her. She closed her eyes and began to sing, "Abide with me," her clear voice rising pure and true to the raftered ceiling. "Abide with me. Fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide." The words flowed from her heart, carrying all her fear and hope. When she opened her eyes, she saw Caleb's head bowed, his shoulders shaking slightly. Others in the congregation sat transfixed, some wiping away tears. "Hold thou thy cross before my closing eyes, shine through the gloom and point me to the skies." As the last note faded, silence held the church in thrall. Then Mrs. Patterson began to clap, and others joined in. Miriam made her way back to her seat, cheeks flushed. After the service, several women stopped to speak with her. Their words were cautious but kind, asking about her health and the baby. She heard one elderly woman whisper to her neighbor, "Perhaps the Lord sent her to us for a reason. Such a voice could only be a blessing." Caleb stood protective and proud beside her, acknowledging each person who approached. The wall of isolation around them had begun to crack, letting in the first warm rays of acceptance. The afternoon sun warmed Miriam's face as she sat on the ranch house porch, her fingers moving steadily over Caleb's work shirt. The worn fabric bore testament to long days of ranch work, and she took care with each neat stitch. Around her, the peaceful sounds of late summer filled the air. Chickens scratching in the yard, a gentle breeze rustling through the cottonwoods, and the distant lowing of cattle. Her heart felt lighter since that morning's church service. The memory of kind words and gentle smiles gave her hope, like tiny seeds planted in fertile soil. Even now, she could hear Mrs. Patterson's warm invitation to join the ladies' quilting circle next week. The screen door creaked, and Caleb emerged, his boots making solid thuds on the wooden planks. He paused, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Would you mind waiting here a moment?" he asked softly. "I have something to show you." Miriam nodded, curious. Caleb disappeared into the barn, and she could hear the scrape of something being moved. When he emerged, he was carrying a rocking chair, its honey-colored wood gleaming in the sunlight. The craftsmanship was beautiful, smooth curves and delicate spindles speaking of careful attention to detail. "I made this some years back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Been keeping it in the barn, couldn't bring myself to." He cleared his throat. "Well, it ought to be used, by someone who needs it." Miriam's hand flew to her mouth as understanding dawned. This was the chair he'd made for his sweetheart, the one who died in childbirth. Her eyes filled with tears at the magnitude of what he was offering, not just a chair, but a piece of his past, his hope for the future. "Mr. Boone," she whispered, "I couldn't possibly—" "Please," he interrupted gently. "You'll need it, with the little one coming." He set the chair down beside her, running his hand along the smooth arm. "I've oiled the wood fresh, fixed the loose rung in the back. It's solid now." Tears spilled down Miriam's cheeks as she rose to touch the chair. Such thoughtfulness, such care for her comfort and that of her unborn child. It overwhelmed her. The wood felt warm beneath her fingers, as if it held all the love that had gone into its making. "Thank you," she managed, her voice trembling. "I've never received such a kindness." Caleb helped her settle into the chair, and its gentle motion soothed her spirit. She drew out her small Amish Bible, its pages well worn from daily reading. The familiar words brought comfort as the afternoon light began to fade. Later, as Miriam helped prepare supper, Amos burst through the kitchen door, his weathered face dark with concern. "Town's buzzing like a hornet's nest," he announced, throwing his hat onto a peg. "That preacher's wife might have shown some kindness, but others are saying it ain't proper. You two living here unmarried?" He fixed Caleb with a hard stare. "Sheriff's been asking questions about debts and such." Caleb's jaw tightened as he rose from the table. "Let them talk. The Lord knows what's in my heart." "It ain't just talk troubling me," Amos pressed. "Saw some strange riders asking questions at the saloon. One of them had a mighty particular interest in Miss Yoda here." Miriam's hands trembled as she set down the pot she was holding. The evening suddenly felt colder, despite the warmth from the cook stove. "I'll protect her," Caleb stated firmly, his voice low and determined, "no matter what comes." As night fell, Miriam sat in her new rocking chair, trying to find peace in its gentle motion. But the howling of coyotes in the distance seemed more ominous than usual, their cries carrying warnings on the wind. She watched through the window as Caleb made his evening rounds, checking the barn and corrals. His shoulders were tense, his hand never far from his gun belt. The sound of hoofbeats on the road made them all freeze. A lone rider passed slowly by the ranch house, his silhouette dark against the rising moon. Though he didn't stop, Miriam recognized the way he sat his horse, the slight forward lean, the familiar tilt of his head. Her heart clenched with fear. "It's him," she whispered, though no one else was in the room. "My father's back." Through the window she saw Caleb standing in the yard, watching the rider disappear into the darkness. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his hand rested on his holstered gun. The sight both frightened and comforted her. Caleb would stand between her and harm, but at what cost to himself? The coyotes howled again, closer now, their wild voices echoing the turmoil in Miriam's heart. She pressed her hand to her growing belly, feeling the flutter of movement within. "Be still, little one," she whispered. "God watches over us." She reached for her Bible, drawing strength from its familiar weight. As she opened it, a small wooden figure fell into her lap, one of Caleb's carvings, a tiny dove with outstretched wings. She hadn't noticed him placing it between the pages, but its presence brought fresh tears to her eyes. Even in the gathering darkness, he found ways to show his care. The screen door opened, and Caleb stepped inside. His eyes met hers across the room, full of unspoken concern and determination. Neither needed to say what they both knew. The peace they'd found was fragile, and storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Miriam's fingers traced the carved dove as she rocked, its smooth wings a reminder of hope in troubled times. Whatever came next, she was no longer alone. In this house, with this quiet, strong man who carved beauty from broken things, she had found something she'd never expected, a place where protection meant more than possession, where kindness flowed freely as water from the well. The coyote's song echoed across the prairie, but here, in the circle of lamplight, Miriam held fast to her faith and the small wooden dove, symbols of a future worth fighting for. The first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate shades of pink and gold as Miriam stepped onto the front porch. She loved these quiet moments when the world seemed fresh and new, full of promise. The morning dew sparkled on the grass, and a meadowlark's song floated across the pasture. Her peaceful reverie shattered as she spotted a familiar figure riding into town. Even at this distance, she recognized the way he sat his horse, straight-backed and proud, like a king on his throne. Her father, Elias Yoder, had abandoned his plain Amish clothes for a flashy vest and wide-brimmed hat that marked him as a gambler. Miriam's hands trembled as she gripped the porch railing. The baby kicked inside her, as if sensing her distress. Behind her, the screen door creaked. "You see him?" Caleb's deep voice was gentle. She nodded, unable to speak. Caleb moved to stand beside her, his solid presence reassuring. "Best we head into town," he said. "Meet this head-on rather than wait for trouble to find us." The wagon ride seemed endless. Miriam sat rigid beside Caleb, her prayer cap offering little protection against the morning sun, or the stares of townspeople as they rolled down the dusty main street. Outside the general store, Elias Yoder waited with several rough-looking men. "Well, if it ain't my ungrateful daughter," Elias called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge of whiskey. "And her protector." He spat the last word like a curse. Caleb helped Miriam down from the wagon, keeping himself between her and her father. "Mr. Yoder," he said evenly, "what brings you back?" "My money brings me back," Elias snarled, swaggering forward. "That debt ain't settled proper, and you know it. Where you hiding them winnings, Boone?" "The debt was settled in trade," Caleb replied, his voice steady but firm. "You made the offer yourself before witnesses." "A father can't trade his own flesh and blood," Elias shouted, drawing curious onlookers. "Ain't natural, ain't legal." Heavy boots thudded on the wooden walkway as Sheriff Carter approached, his badge catching the morning light. "What's all this commotion about?" "Sheriff." Elias turned, suddenly ingratiating. "This here rancher's holding my daughter against payment of a legitimate debt. I'm demanding proper settlement, in cash." The sheriff's weathered face creased with concern. "That true, Boone?" "About the debt." "Sir," Caleb spoke carefully. Mr. Yoder offered his daughter's care in settlement of gambling losses. I accepted to protect her from worse alternatives. Protect her? Elias laughed harshly. You took her like any other payment, and now you're trying to cheat me proper compensation. The sheriff shook his head slowly. Boone, you know the law. Debts must be settled in legal tender, not barter, especially not— He glanced uncomfortably at Miriam. Not people. Then I'll sell her contract to Madame Rosa's house. Elias threatened, naming the local brothel. She'll earn back what's owed me quick enough there. Caleb's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained controlled. Miss Yoder is under my protection. She's not property to be sold. The law says different. Elias sneered. Sheriff, I want my daughter returned to my custody, now! Miriam felt the world spinning around her. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and she pressed one hand to her belly while gripping Caleb's arm with the other. Mr. Boone, she whispered, please don't let him— Come on, Caleb said softly, turning her toward the wagon. We're going home. This ain't finished, Elias shouted after them. The law's on my side. The return journey passed in tense silence. Miriam's shoulders shook with silent sobs as Caleb guided the horses homeward. At the ranch, Amos waited on the porch, his lined face dark with concern. Saw you riding into town earlier, he said. Figured trouble was brewing. Inside the kitchen, Miriam sank into a chair, her legs too weak to hold her. He'll come for me, she whispered. He'll sell me to that place. Caleb knelt beside her chair, his eyes level with hers. Listen to me, Miriam. You belong here, with people who care for your welfare. That won't change unless you choose to leave. But the sheriff— Let me worry about the sheriff. Caleb's voice was gentle but determined. You focus on keeping yourself and the little one healthy. Evening settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Through the kitchen window, Miriam watched Caleb at the grinding wheel, methodically sharpening his tools. The rhythmic scraping sound seemed to echo the tension in the air. Every so often, he would test a blade's edge with his thumb, his movements precise and purposeful. Amos stepped onto the porch, pipe smoke curling around his grey head. You know, he said quietly, the law might side with her father. Man's got rights to his kin, even if he ain't worthy of them. Caleb paused in his work, the wheel slowly spinning to a stop. The law don't always match up with what's right. Could cost you everything, Amos warned. Your reputation's already suffering. Stand against the law, and you might lose the ranch itself. Miriam's heart clenched at these words. She watched Caleb return to his task, the sparks flying from the grinding wheel like tiny stars in the gathering dusk. This quiet, honorable man was risking everything— his good name, his livelihood, perhaps even his freedom— to protect her and her unborn child. The weight of that sacrifice pressed heavy on her heart as she prepared supper, her movements automatic as her mind churned with worry. Through the window she could still see Caleb working, his broad shoulders set with determination as he prepared for whatever battle lay ahead. She had fled one prison only to bring danger to the doorstep of her sanctuary. Yet even as guilt gnawed at her, she felt a fierce gratitude for Caleb's unwavering protection. Here was a man who understood that true strength lay not in ownership, but in standing firm for what was right. The grinding wheel's song continued into the darkness, steady and sure as Caleb's own heart. Morning came too soon, the sun rising harsh and bright over the Colorado plains. Miriam stood at the kitchen window, kneading bread dough with trembling hands. They needed flour. The barrel was nearly empty, which meant another trip into town. After yesterday's confrontation, the thought made her stomach twist. Caleb appeared in the doorway, his shadow falling across the wooden floor. Wagon's ready whenever you are." Miriam wiped her hands on her apron. "Perhaps I should stay here." "No." Caleb's voice was firm but gentle. "We can't hide forever, and we need supplies." The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled down the dusty road toward town. Miriam sat straight and proper in her plain dress and prayer cap, though her heart fluttered like a trapped bird. Caleb drove steadily, his broad shoulders set with determination. The town seemed to hold its breath as they approached. Women on the boardwalk whispered behind their hands. Men stopped their conversations to stare. A group of cowboys outside the saloon nudged each other, watching with dark amusement. They had just stepped down from the wagon when Elias Yoder burst out of the saloon, his face flushed with drink despite the early hour. "There he is!" Elias bellowed, pointing an accusing finger. "The thief who stole my daughter." Heads turned. People gathered, drawn by the spectacle. Miriam felt their eyes boring into her like hot coals. "Ain't right," someone muttered. "Man takes another man's kin. Cursed, that's what he is." Another voice added. "First his sweetheart, now this girl." Caleb placed himself between Miriam and the growing crowd. "Miss Yoder needs flour," he said calmly to the store owner. "And sugar, if you please." The preacher stood at the edge of the crowd, his face troubled. He took a step forward, then hesitated, caught between judgment and mercy. "You'll burn for this, Boone!" Elias shouted. "Taking advantage of an innocent girl, my own flesh and blood?" Miriam wanted to scream that her father had tried to sell her, that Caleb had saved her, but shame locked her throat. She clutched her packages close as Caleb helped her back into the wagon. They were barely out of town when the tears began to fall. All the fear, humiliation, and guilt she had been holding back burst forth like a summer storm. "I am nothing but trouble to you," she sobbed. "Your good name, your standing in town, all ruined because of me. I am a burden you should never have taken on." Caleb pulled the team to a stop. The horses stomped and snorted in the sudden quiet. He turned to face her, his large, calloused hands reaching out to grip hers with surprising gentleness. "No, Miriam." His voice was low and intense. "You and that child are my blessing." She stared at him, stunned by the declaration. The breeze stirred his dark hair as he continued to hold her gaze, his eyes full of something that made her heart skip. They completed the journey in silence, but it was different now, filled with unspoken things that hung between them like morning mist. That evening, after supper was cleared away, Caleb lit the lamp in the sitting room. Its warm glow cast dancing shadows on the walls. Miriam sat in the rocking chair he had given her, her mending forgotten in her lap as she watched him stoke the fire. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, settling into the chair opposite her. "About my late sweetheart, Mary." Miriam set aside her sewing, sensing the weight of what was to come. "She was like you in some ways," he continued softly. "Gentle, full of faith. When she told me she was with child, I thought God had blessed me beyond measure." His voice caught. But there were complications. The doctor came too late. The lamplight flickered across his face as he spoke, revealing the pain etched there. "I was outside the door, praying harder than I ever had before, begging God to spare them both." He looked down at his hands. "He didn't answer those prayers, not the way I wanted." "Oh, Caleb," Miriam whispered. "For years after, I believed I was cursed, that God had turned his face from me." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "But now I see differently. He sent you to me, you and your little one, to show me that redemption is possible, that hope can bloom even in the darkest places." Miriam felt tears well up in her eyes, but these were different from the bitter drops she had shed earlier. She leaned forward, placing her small hand over his large one. "Curses are man's lies, not God's truth," she said firmly, drawing on the wisdom of her Amish upbringing. "The Lord does not punish with curses. He teaches with trials and blesses with love." A single tear tracked down Caleb's weathered cheek. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering night, its song pure and sweet. Inside the warm circle of lamplight, two wounded souls began to heal, their paths joining like streams flowing together after long and lonely journeys. "Thank you," Caleb said simply, but those two words carried the weight of years of pain finally lifting. Miriam smiled through her own tears, feeling the baby move within her as if in blessing. The old rocking chair creaked gently as she swayed, its sound a quiet comfort in the peaceful room. The morning sun painted golden stripes across the barnyard as Miriam scattered corn for the chickens. The hens clucked and pecked around her feet, their feathers catching the light. Caleb leaned against the fence, a rare smile softening his weathered face. "Look at that old red hen," he said, pointing to a plump chicken strutting importantly through the flock. "Think she's the queen of the whole yard." Miriam laughed, the sound as clear as a bell in the crisp morning air. "She reminds me of Mrs. Peterson at the general store, always holding her head so high." Caleb's deep chuckle joined hers. The moment felt precious, like a delicate bubble floating in the breeze. These small moments of joy had become more frequent lately, sprouting like wildflowers after rain. Later that evening, as Miriam sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, heavy footsteps approached. She turned to see Amos, looking uncomfortable but determined, holding a steaming cup of tea. "Thought you might like this," he said gruffly, extending the cup. "Noticed you weren't feeling your best at supper." Miriam accepted the tea with surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher." Amos shifted his weight, hat in hand. "Been meaning to say, I was wrong about you, Miss Yoda. Thought you'd bring nothing but trouble, but—" He cleared his throat. "You've brought something good to this place, something it needed." Tears pricked at Miriam's eyes as she watched the old ranch hand shuffle away. His words meant more than he knew. The peace of that evening shattered the next morning when Caleb rode in from town, his face grave. He held a yellow telegram in his hand, the paper crumpled from his tight grip. "Your father," he said quietly to Miriam. "He's gathering men from the mining camps. Rough sorts who don't ask questions if the pay is good." Miriam's hand flew to her growing belly, protective and afraid. She watched as Caleb moved with grim purpose, checking his rifles, storing extra ammunition in the house. That night, she found him in the barn, cleaning his Winchester by lamplight. His shoulders were tense, his movements sharp with worry. "I'm asking the Lord for guidance," he said without looking up. "Never wanted to harm anyone, but I'll protect you and the little one with my last breath if needed." Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Despite the threats hanging over them, Miriam insisted on attending church. "We cannot let fear rule us," she said firmly, smoothing her plain dress. The little church was fuller than usual. As Miriam and Caleb entered, they felt the weight of every gaze. But something had changed. Instead of whispers and turned backs, they received quiet nods, even a few gentle smiles. When the preacher asked Miriam to sing, she rose slowly, one hand resting on her belly. The first notes of Amazing Grace filled the small space, pure and true. One by one, people stood, moved by the depth of feeling in her voice. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even the banker's wife, who had been among their harshest critics, was weeping openly. The preacher's sermon that day spoke of mercy, of judging not lest ye be judged. His eyes met Caleb's several times as he spoke of how God's love often came wrapped in unexpected packages, and how true Christianity meant standing with the vulnerable against those who would harm them. The ride home was quiet, filled with hope, but also exhaustion. Halfway there, Miriam gasped suddenly, doubling over in pain. "Miriam!" Caleb's voice was sharp with fear. He pulled the wagon to a halt, helping her sit straighter. "The baby?" "Sharp pains," she managed through clenched teeth. "Too early, it's too early." Caleb's face went pale. The memory of another woman, another child, threatened to overwhelm him. But he forced it back, focusing on the present need. He flicked the reins, urging the horses faster while trying to keep the ride smooth. At the ranch, he carried her inside, his heart pounding with terror. Amos rode for the doctor while Caleb sat beside her bed, holding her hand, praying with a desperation he hadn't felt in years. Hours passed. The pains gradually eased. By morning, Miriam was pale but smiling weakly. "False pains," she whispered. "The doctor says it happens sometimes. The baby is still safe." Caleb sagged with relief, but the fear lingered. They both knew what this warning meant. Time was growing short. Soon the baby would come, ready or not. And somewhere out there, Elias Yoder was gathering his forces, a storm building on the horizon. Amos appeared in the doorway, his lined face serious. "Telegram came while you were resting, Miss Miriam. Your father's been seen in Silver Creek, asking about hired guns." Caleb stood, his shadow falling across Miriam's bed. "Then we'll be ready. Won't we, Amos?" The old ranch hand nodded grimly. "Reckon we will. Ain't letting no harm come to our girl and her little one." Miriam touched her belly, feeling the strong kicks of the child within. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its morning song. Despite the danger looming, she felt a surge of determination. This was her home now. These were her people, and with God's help, they would face whatever came together. The barn workshop smelled of fresh-cut pine and sawdust as Caleb ran his calloused hand over the smooth wood of the cradle he was building. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the open doors, catching the fine dust motes that danced in the air. He worked steadily, measuring twice before each cut, ensuring every joint fit perfectly. This cradle was different from the other furniture he had crafted over the years. Each stroke of the plane, each careful measurement held meaning beyond mere woodworking. His thoughts drifted to the child who would soon rest within these rails, and his hands moved with extra care. Miriam appeared in the doorway, her plain dress catching the breeze. She watched silently as Caleb worked, one hand resting on her swollen belly. The sight of the cradle brought tears to her eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude for this man who had become her protector. "May I?" she asked softly, approaching the nearly finished piece. Caleb stepped back, nodding. Miriam's fingers traced the gentle curves of the headboard, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath her touch. Her lips moved in silent prayer as she whispered ancient Amish blessings over the cradle, the same ones her grandmother had spoken over her own bed as a child. "Der Herr segne und behüte dich," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Lord bless you and keep you." The peaceful moment shattered as hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Amos rode hard, his horse's flanks lathered with sweat. His face was grim as he dismounted, spurs jingling against the packed earth. "Caleb!" he called, his voice urgent. "Got news from town." Caleb set down his tools, moving to stand protectively near Miriam. "What is it, Amos?" The old ranch hand's eyes darted to Miriam before settling on Caleb. "Your father's been seen, Miss Miriam." Him and two rough-looking fellows camped just outside town. He spat in the dust. "Been in the saloon, bragging about taking you back by force." Miriam's face went pale, her hands clutching the cradle for support. Caleb's jaw tightened as he reached for the revolver at his hip, checking it was loaded. The weight of it felt heavy in his hand, a burden he had hoped to avoid. "How many guns?" he asked quietly. "3 that I saw. Mean-looking sorts from the mining camps, by their look. The kind that ask no questions if the pay is good enough." Thunder rumbled in the distance as dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. The air felt thick with tension, matching the storm brewing both in the sky and in their hearts. Miriam watched as Caleb paced the workshop, his face troubled. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to fight warring with his need to keep her safe. Her hand trembled as she touched his arm. "What will become of the child?" she whispered, voice breaking. "If something happens to you, if my father—" She couldn't finish the thought. Caleb turned to her, his eyes softening as they met hers. He took her hands in his grip gentle but firm. "Your baby will never be alone," he said, his voice low and fierce with conviction. "Not while I live. I swear it before God and man." The promise hung in the air between them, as solid as the wooden cradle beside them. Amos cleared his throat, looking away from the intimate moment. "I'll ride the fence line," he said gruffly. "Keep watch for any unwelcome visitors." As evening descended, the storm clouds grew darker, occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the prairie in stark bursts. Caleb moved through the house, checking windows and doors, making sure every entrance was secure. The Winchester rifle stood ready by the door, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. In the main room, Miriam sat in the rocking chair Caleb had given her, her worn Bible open in her lap. The lamplight cast a warm glow around her as she read aloud from the Psalms, her voice steady despite her fear. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she read, the familiar words bringing comfort. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Caleb kept vigil by the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Every now and then he would rise to peer out the windows into the gathering darkness, his hand never far from his revolver. The storm drew closer, lightning flashing more frequently now, thunder rolling across the prairie like distant drums. Miriam continued reading, her voice rising and falling with the ancient words of comfort and protection. She prayed not just for herself and her unborn child, but for Caleb, for the ranch, for all of them, even for her father, though it hurt her heart to think of him. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The wind picked up outside, whistling through the eaves of the house. Tree branches scraped against the windows like skeletal fingers. Yet inside, despite the growing storm and the threat of violence looming in the darkness, there was a strange peace in the room. The peace of people who had found their truth and were ready to stand for it, come what may. Caleb watched Miriam as she read, her face serene in the lamplight despite the danger. He had made his choice weeks ago in that smoky saloon, and he would make it again 1,000 times over. Whatever her father and his hired guns might bring, they would face it together. Lightning flashed again, closer now, illuminating the yard in brilliant white. Thunder crashed overhead as the storm finally broke, rain beginning to drum against the roof. But Miriam's voice never wavered as she continued to read, her words a shield against both the storm outside and the one that was surely coming. The storm broke with sudden fury. Rain hammered against the ranch house windows as wind howled through every crack and crevice. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, followed by thunder that shook the very foundations. Inside, an even more terrible storm was brewing. "Caleb!" Miriam's cry pierced through the din of the tempest. She clutched her belly, face contorted in pain as she doubled over in the rocking chair. Caleb dropped the rifle he had been cleaning and rushed to her side. "What is it? The baby?" Something's not right, she gasped, gripping his arm with surprising strength. It's too early. Her words sent ice through his veins. Too early. Just like before. Just like Sarah. The memories he had fought so hard to bury came rushing back. Another stormy night. Another woman he loved crying out in pain. "Let's get you to bed," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady as he helped her up. Thunder crashed overhead as they made their way to her room, Miriam leaning heavily against him. As he eased her onto the bed, another contraction seized her. Her cry echoed through the house, mixing with the howl of the wind. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she gripped the quilt, knuckles white with strain. Caleb's hands shook as he poured water from the pitcher into a basin. What did he know about birthing babies? Sarah had had a proper doctor, and even then the sound of hoofbeats carried through the storm. Amos burst through the door, water streaming from his hat and coat. "Caleb! They're coming!" The old ranch hand's voice was urgent. Elias and his men spotted them crossing the creek. 10 minutes, maybe less. Another cry from Miriam tore through the house. Caleb looked from her to the door and back, his heart pounding. How could he protect them both? He checked his revolver. 6 shots, against 3 armed men. "Lord help us," Amos muttered, crossing himself. Caleb knelt beside Miriam's bed, taking her trembling hand in his. Her skin felt clammy, her breathing rapid and shallow. Fear clouded her eyes as another contraction gripped her. "I can't leave you," he whispered. "But if they get here, go," she gasped between pains. "You must protect us both." Thunder rattled the windows as if trying to break them. Lightning illuminated the room in harsh flashes, casting strange shadows on the walls. Caleb felt tears burning in his eyes as he looked at Miriam's suffering face. He dropped to his knees beside the bed, clasping his hands together. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice rough with emotion, "do not take them from me. Not like Sarah. Please give me strength. Show me the way." Rain lashed against the house like bullets. In the distance, they could hear horses approaching. Amos stood at the window, rifle ready. "They're coming up the road," he reported grimly. 3 riders. Caleb rose, torn between duty and devotion. Miriam reached for his hand one last time, her grip weakening as another contraction began building. Then, through the chaos of wind and rain, through Miriam's labored breathing and the approaching hoofbeats, came a sharp knock at the door. Everyone froze. It wasn't from the direction of the road. Someone was at the back door. "Hello?" a woman's voice called. "I saw the light. Please, let me in." Amos trained his rifle on the door as Caleb approached cautiously. He opened it to find Naomi Sozy, the Ute midwife, standing there completely soaked, her long black hair plastered to her face by the rain. "I was visiting the Peterson farm," she explained quickly, stepping inside. "Saw your lights through the storm. Then I heard the cries." Her dark eyes took in the scene. Caleb's drawn gun, Amos at the window, Miriam's sounds of distress. "The baby comes too soon," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "And there are men." "I know these things," Naomi said calmly, already removing her wet shawl. "I have brought many babies into this world, in peace and in danger." She moved toward Miriam's room with quiet authority. "You protect the house. I will protect her." Caleb choked back tears of relief and gratitude. Here, in their darkest hour, when all seemed lost, help had arrived like an answer to his desperate prayer. "They're at the gate," Amos called from the window. Naomi was already by Miriam's side, speaking soft words of comfort as she felt her belly with experienced hands. She looked up at Caleb, her face serene despite the chaos. "Go. Do what you must. We will be fine." Thunder shook the house again as Caleb took his position by the front window, rifle ready. His heart still twisted at each of Miriam's cries, but somehow he felt stronger now. God had sent them help in their hour of need. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could see 3 shadowy figures approaching the house, their guns glinting in the lightning flashes. Elias had come to claim what he thought was his, but Caleb knew now, with unshakable certainty, that God had other plans. Behind him, Naomi's steady voice rose above the storm, guiding Miriam through her labor. "Breathe, sister," she said. "The Great Spirit walks with us tonight." Caleb tightened his grip on his rifle and said another silent prayer of thanks as he prepared to defend his home and the new family God had given him to protect. Inside the ranch house, Naomi took command of the situation with calm efficiency. Her experienced hands moved swiftly as she assessed what needed to be done. "Amos," she called to the old ranch hand, "fetch every clean cloth you can find. And we need water, lots of it." She stoked the kitchen fire, setting a large pot to boil. "The baby comes quickly now." Amos hurried to comply, his earlier gruffness replaced by urgent concern. He returned with an armload of sheets and towels, then rushed to pump water from the kitchen pump. Caleb knelt beside Miriam's bed, holding her hand as another contraction seized her. "I'm here," he whispered, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "You're doing so well." Miriam's fingers tightened around his as she fought through the pain. "Don't leave," she gasped. "Like thunder in the mountains." Elias's voice boomed from outside, cutting through the storm. "Send her out, Boone, or we'll burn you out." Caleb's jaw tightened. He squeezed Miriam's hand once more before standing. "I have to deal with this. Naomi will take care of you." The Ute midwife nodded as she arranged her supplies. "Go. The baby and mother are my responsibility now." Rain drummed against the roof as Caleb stepped onto the porch, water immediately soaking through his shirt. Lightning revealed 3 mounted figures in the yard, Elias in the lead, with a rifle across his saddle. "This is your last warning," Caleb called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "Leave my property." Elias's laugh was harsh. "Your property?" "That's my daughter in there, and I aim to collect what's mine." "She stopped being yours when you traded her like cattle?" Caleb replied, standing his ground. A crack split the air, not thunder, but gunfire. Splinters flew from the barn wall as one of Elias's men fired a warning shot. "Next one won't miss," Elias threatened. Inside, Miriam cried out again. The sound tore at Caleb's heart, but he held firm on the porch, rain streaming down his face. Suddenly, points of light appeared on the road, lanterns bobbing through the darkness. A group of townspeople approached, led by the preacher holding high a storm lamp. "What's all this?" Elias demanded as the group drew near. The preacher's voice rang clear above the storm. "We heard shots, came to see justice done." "Justice is what I'm here for," Elias snarled. "That man stole my daughter." "Saved her, more like," someone in the crowd called out. "We all saw how you treated her." "Remember the hymn she sang," another voice added. "God's light shines through that girl." The preacher stepped forward, rain dripping from his hat brim. "The Lord commands us to protect the innocent, Elias Yoda. That's what Caleb Boone has done. What are you doing here with guns in the night?" More lanterns appeared as other townsfolk arrived, drawn by the commotion. They formed a circle of light in the rain-swept darkness, faces stern as they regarded Elias and his men. Inside the house, Miriam's labor intensified. Naomi worked with practiced movements, speaking soft encouragement in mixed English and Ute. "The baby comes now. You are strong, like the river that shapes the stone." "Caleb!" Miriam called between pains. "I need him!" Amos appeared at the door. "Go to her," he told Caleb. "We'll handle this trash." The old ranch hand's rifle glinted in the lamplight as he took position on the porch. Caleb hurried back inside to Miriam's room, his wet clothes leaving puddles on the floor. He took her reaching hand, his heart pounding as he saw the intensity in Naomi's face. "The baby crowns," the midwife announced. "Now, Miriam, push with all your strength." Miriam's cry pierced the air as she bore down. Caleb supported her shoulders, whispering prayers and words of love. "You can do this. God is with us. I'm here." Outside, voices rose in argument, but Caleb barely heard them. His world had narrowed to this room, to Miriam's grip on his hand, to Naomi's steady instructions. "Once more," Naomi commanded. "The baby comes." Miriam gathered her remaining strength and pushed. Suddenly, a new sound filled the room, the thin, angry wail of a newborn taking its first breath. "A girl," Naomi announced, quickly wrapping the infant in warm cloths. "Strong and healthy, like her mother." Tears spilled down Caleb's cheeks as he kissed Miriam's damp forehead. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Lord." Miriam's eyes shone with exhausted joy as Naomi placed the wrapped bundle in her arms. The baby's cries softened as she nuzzled against her mother's chest. Through the window came the sound of horses galloping away, Elias and his men retreating into the storm. Then voices raised in celebration as the townspeople realized what had happened. "A baby's been born!" The preacher called out, "God has blessed this house." Caleb couldn't take his eyes off Miriam and their daughter, for that's how he already thought of her, his daughter in all the ways that mattered. Lightning flashed again, but its light seemed gentle now, blessing the scene as mother and child rested in the soft lamplight. Naomi smiled as she cleaned her hands. The Great Spirit has brought new life. The storm passes. Now peace can come. Morning light spilled through the windows of the ranch house, washing away the night's shadows. The storm had passed, leaving behind fresh-washed air and puddles that gleamed like mirrors in the yard. Sheriff Carter arrived as the sun climbed higher, his deputies flanking a subdued Elias Yoder. The gambler's hands were bound, his swagger gone. They had caught him trying to flee town in the early hours. "Your days of causing trouble are done," the sheriff declared, confiscating Elias's gun belt. "The circuit judge will hear about your threats and gunfire, and your gambling debts." Inside, Miriam lay propped against pillows, her newborn daughter sleeping peacefully beside her, wrapped in soft blankets. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but joy lit her face as she gazed at her child. Caleb stood watch nearby, his broad shoulders finally relaxed as morning sunlight warmed the room. The sound of wagon wheels announced the arrival of townspeople. They came bearing gifts, women with fresh-baked bread and pies, men carrying blankets and supplies. Even those who had once whispered cruel gossip now stepped forward with shame-faced smiles and gentle words. "Such a beautiful child," Mrs. Peterson murmured, laying a hand-stitched quilt across the foot of the bed. "God's blessing shines in her face." The preacher arrived last, his Bible tucked under his arm. He gathered everyone in Miriam's room, his voice carrying weight and authority as he spoke. "Let it be known before all witnesses," he declared, "that any supposed debts or claims against Miriam Yoder are hereby dissolved. The Lord commands us to show mercy, and mercy has triumphed here." He turned to face Miriam directly. "You are free, child, free to choose your own path forward." Tears spilled down Miriam's cheeks as the words sank in. After months of fear and shame, after her father's betrayal and the town's scorn, she was truly free. The baby stirred, making tiny sounds that drew gentle laughter from the gathered crowd. Caleb moved closer to the bed, his eyes wet with emotion. "I've prayed every night," he said softly, his voice rough with feeling. "Prayed for the Lord to grant me family again after so much loss." He looked at Miriam and the child, wonder written across his features. "Now I see he had a plan all along." Miriam reached for his hand, her fingers twining with his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me when no one else would." The preacher nodded in approval as morning light streamed through the window, catching the tears on Miriam's cheeks and turning them to diamonds. The townspeople murmured blessings, while outside, the sheriff's wagon rattled away, taking Elias to face justice at last. In that moment, watching Caleb bend tenderly over mother and child, not a soul present could doubt that love and mercy had won the day. The family that God had brought together through trial and storm would now walk forward in His grace, protected and blessed at last. Golden prairie grass swayed in the gentle breeze as summer settled over the ranch. 6 weeks had passed since the stormy night that brought new life and redemption. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard where Caleb worked, his strong hands steadily mending the north fence. Inside the ranch house, Miriam sat in the restored rocking chair, its smooth motion soothing little Ruth as she nursed. The chair's wood gleamed with fresh polish, every crack lovingly repaired by Caleb's careful work. Through the open window, she could hear him humming as he worked, a sound that brought warmth to her heart. The screen door creaked as Amos shuffled in, carrying a steaming pot of his famous trail stew. His weathered face broke into a gentle smile at the sight of mother and child. Gone was the suspicion that had once darkened his eyes. Now he moved about the kitchen with grandfatherly pride, setting out bowls and fresh bread. "Reckon it's about time to call that man of yours in to eat," Amos said, his gruff voice softened with affection. "Can't have him working on an empty stomach." Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Miriam dressed Ruth in a white gown she had sewn herself, tiny pearl buttons gleaming at the neck. Caleb donned his best shirt, running nervous fingers through his hair as they loaded into the wagon. The church bells rang across the valley, their joyful pealing drawing folks from miles around. Inside the whitewashed chapel, sunlight streamed through tall windows as Miriam and Caleb stood before the congregation, little Ruth cradled in her father's strong arms. The preacher raised his hands over them, his voice carrying to the rafters. "Lord, we ask your blessing upon this family, brought together by your divine providence. Let their love be a testament to your grace and mercy." "Amen," the congregation responded as one. Then Miriam's clear voice lifted in song, leading the familiar hymn she had shared with Caleb that first night on the porch. The entire church joined in, their voices swelling with joy and acceptance. Caleb, the man once branded as cursed, now stood tall and proud, holding his daughter while tears of gratitude traced down his cheeks. That evening, lamplight spilled warm and golden from the ranch house windows. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh bread filled the kitchen. Miriam hummed softly as she moved about, the same hymn from their first night together floating through the rooms. Caleb sat in his chair by the fire, Ruth sleeping peacefully against his chest. His large hand gently patted her back as he whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for this precious gift, for giving this lonely man a family." Miriam paused in her work, watching them with tender eyes. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with baby coos and gentle laughter. Love had transformed the ranch into a true home, where faith bloomed like prairie flowers after rain, and second chances proved as real as the solid ground beneath their feet. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.